and move on to this interview with Glenn Greenwald and Marianne Williamson, and we're going to focus on the foreign policy aspect, and maybe if time permits, a little bit of the Bernie aspect, because he touches on both of those things. I think that either Marianne may have been listening, to what has been said about her views on foreign policy. Maybe someone has spoken to her. I did notice her responses here seem a little bit different, but at the same time, like, there are certain parts where I was like, so what is she really saying? Let's go ahead and get started with it. But here we go. Let me see if I can, this is on Rumble. So toggle full screen. Is that what I'm supposed to do? Okay, here we go.
In 1968, which is undoubtedly one of the most fascinating and in some sense tragic years in American history. And it is interesting because it wasn't just that there was a primary, it actually forced Lyndon Johnson to announce he wouldn't seek re-election, in part because the success of Eugene McCarthy and Bobby Kennedy, until he was murdered, made it clear he was likely to face a lot of headwind, largely over the Vietnam War. And that same year, Martin Luther King gave what was one of his last and greatest speeches, where he kind of said, for a long time I focused all my attention on domestic issues and racial issues, and I now realize those issues are inextricably linked to questions of foreign policy. What the United States does overseas in its various wars is a big reason why we have so much inequality here at home, and they cannot be extricated. I don't want to suggest there's a equivalency between the war in Vietnam and the war in Ukraine. Obviously, there's enormous differences. At the same time, Joe Biden himself says that because of the war in Ukraine, we're closer now to nuclear Armageddon than at any time since 1962, because we're facing a proxy war with the nuclear armed power. The last time people were asked to vote on that was in May, when the Biden administration requested $40 billion on top of the $15 billion that had already been authorized. Every Democrat, every single one of them in unity voted yes. It was 6 or 7 dozen Republicans who voted no. Most Republicans voted yes as well. How would you have voted on that authorization for $40 billion on top of the $15 billion back in May to fuel the proxy war in Ukraine?
Okay, just to be clear, he's asking her, how would she have voted on the funding to Ukraine, going back to that $40 billion? That was, I think, was the biggest package at that point in time. So that's the question. How would she have voted? That's it. Let's go on.
I think if you're going to be an anti-imperialist, you have to be an anti-imperialist, whether it's an American or a Russian. And even though I don't think that the United States has had clean hands here regarding our relationship to NATO, regarding the Aegis missiles in Poland, I don't think any of that was a justification for this brutal dictator to make the invasion that he did. So I.
I'm sorry. Eric said Sabby has to translate Glenn's question. I just like to repeat it for people, people are kind of like, okay, just so we know what she's supposed to answer here. Now, this is where I say, I think that someone either has spoken to her, or maybe she's kind of taken to heart what people have been saying about her views about foreign policy. And when we come to like Russia, Ukraine, that was a big one. And Israel and Palestine is also a big issue. So I noticed this time around, she's saying that she realizes that the U.S. is not innocent here. They're not clean. They don't have clean hands. She realizes that, it sounds like she realizes that NATO is also problematic. And this is different from what I've heard her say before. And so that's why I said, I think that someone may have spoken to her, or either she's been listening to what people have been saying about her stances in reference to foreign policy, particular with this war with Russia and Ukraine. But I do want to just remind you one more time, the question that Glenn had is, how would you have voted for that $40 billion package to send that money to Ukraine? Let's bring it back to that point and let's continue.
Have felt that any withdrawal of support until until very recently, would be simply to say that it's okay for there to be no more Ukraine. And that would be intolerable to me. But we have known, General Milley has said it, the RAND Corporation has said it, this is going to be a negotiated settlement. And I think we have a moment here where something might be happening. Xi talking to Putin, presenting some principles of possibility for a negotiated settlement. We'll see what Zelensky does and what Zelensky says about that. And I think the United States should do everything possible to support that negotiated settlement and a diplomatic solution.
But the question was not what the United States should have done, but how would you have voted for that package? That was the question. Would you have voted for it or would you have voted against it? Now, you notice earlier on, she said like it would have been a mistake to completely withdraw support. But that wasn't the question, though. The question was about that $40 billion package. This is why I kept repeating to you Glenn's question, because if you think about it, she really didn't answer the question.
So the posture of the United States government is expressed by John Kirby, the former Pentagon spokesman who now works in the White House, and other U.S. officials when asked about the potential for a ceasefire and diplomatic relations or diplomatic attempts to resolve the war has been, we're totally opposed to any ceasefire. We think that it would allow the Russians time to rebuild. Do you agree with that? Do you think that the United States and other NATO countries should continue to oppose a ceasefire and fuel the war? Or would you be in favor of kind of a Chinese attempt, along with the Russians and Ukrainians, to forge a ceasefire in the hope of getting a resolution to the war?
It shouldn't be John Kirby's decision. It shouldn't be the U.S. State Department's decision. I think we need to hear what Zelensky himself has to say. Zelensky has said that he is open, that he's interested. He wants to hear what the Chinese have to say. We know that Xi talked to Putin, but there hasn't been any report that he's talked yet, even virtually, to Zelensky. So, no, the United States should not be making that decision. The United States should be doing everything to support any possibility that's occurring here of a negotiated settlement in Ukraine.
So,
see, that's very different than what she said before. You know, when she came on RBN, this is different than what she said before. So that's what I'm saying. Like now she's saying that there should be some type of negotiation. Let's go on. Because you know Glenn's going to ask a follow-up to that.
Just to be clear on that, so many of Zelensky's statements, especially over the last 4 or 5 months, have become almost, I would say, more kind of maximalist, that he has no interest in ending that war until not only is Russia expelled from every inch of Ukrainian territory, but Crimea is wrenched out of the hands of the Russians as well. And he is willing to fight for not only months, but years, if necessary, in order to accomplish those war goals. So if the position of Zelensky is, we don't want to stop this war until every one of our objectives is achieved, including expelling Russia from Crimea, would that mean you would continue to just open the Treasury of the United States and continue to pour unlimited sums of money for as long as Zelensky demands it?
The way that Glenn asked these questions, who was it? Salma said Greenwald is a masterful interviewer. Listen, the way that Glenn asked these questions, this lets you know he's asking these questions in a way to make sure you're really paying attention to what he's asking you, because he's laying it all out there. And this is why I was repeating the question, because I want people to understand this is what he's actually asking you. So let's see what Marianne says here.
Well, first of all, Zelensky's comments the other day are different than the ones that you just described. So first of all, let's hear what Zelensky has to say now. And number two, no, you don't just open up the Treasury. I would never support any kind of like a blank check for this. We should be taking whatever actions will help a negotiated settlement, but I'd like it to be a negotiated settlement that does allow Ukraine to exist as a country. And there have
See, this is different. That's different than what she said on Status Quo, and that's different than what she said on RBN. Because now she's saying she does not support like the blank check idea.
Been in times when such a suggestion would not have.
No, I get that, but I mean, just what are the limits that you would impose on the U.S.'s support for Ukraine?
I think we should be open to what.
So that's Glenn asking. So what he's doing is he's asking that question again because he didn't get the answer to what he was trying to ask. Like, are there any limits that you would impose? And if so, what would those limits be?
So I think that we should be open to any moment when there might be the possibility of a negotiated settlement that would allow for the existence of Ukraine. And I think, and like I said, we might be on the verge of such a moment. That's why what's happening now with China is interesting. We live in a multipolar world now. This is not about the United States just dictating what we want all the time. There are other powers. And it's like when Macron tried to make some kind of a negotiation happen, try to broker some kind of a deal. And I'm not naive about the Chinese Communist Party, but if they have some ideas on the table here that could maybe bring a negotiated settlement closer between Zelensky and Putin, then I think the United States should say, hey, let's hear what it is and let's do what we can to support that.
But notice she didn't answer the question about the money. Because see, this is what was that the Tory said? The Tory said, Marianne is taking her cue from Bernie Sanders, LMFA. Well, notice she didn't answer the monetary question. Like, she didn't answer the question, like, would she continue to blank check? Would she have voted for that $40 billion? When it comes to the money piece, she's not actually answering that part of the question. That's why Glenn kind of reframed it and asked the question again.
So speaking of China and the Chinese Communist Party, there was a big hearing held today in the House of Representatives. I don't know if you had a chance to see it, but it was about the Biden administration's announcement that it is essentially ready to demand that TikTok either sell itself to an American company or to business interests that the United States government trusts more than its current ownership, or just be banned outright in the United States. Is that a proposal that you support?
You know, I take surveillance seriously. I take surveillance seriously, stealing data seriously, whether it's Facebook or the Chinese. I do think it's a serious issue. The idea that your data is going right into the data system of the Chinese Communist Party. That's not like nothing. But at the same time, it's also, I wish that we saw that same kind of interest in what's going on with Facebook and every other country here in the United States, which should be regulated. So the fact that the conversation is on the table is not illegitimate. But let's see where it goes and what happens. I see both sides of that argument to some extent, but no, I don't think we should get rid of TikTok. I myself am as a candidate. I mean, TikTok is I thought TikTok, had its value before, and I certainly see its value now. And I think.
Thank you so much for saying this, Nolan. Communist Party of China, not Chinese Communist Party. Thank you for saying that. A lot of people have been framing it that way, though, Nolan. A lot of people have been saying, or in media have been saying communist, the Chinese Communist Party. I have heard them saying that, but thank you for that clarification there.
To some people, particularly the younger generation, we don't have to rush to an answer on every single issue the moment something occurs.
But the question, so see, this is kind of, again, I feel like she's not answering the question because he's asking, like, would you support that? A ban on TikTok in the United States? And she goes on to say, like, what she likes about TikTok, and she goes on to say, like, her concerns about, I've told you guys this before, but the whole China thing, a lot of it with the U.S. government is just totally economic because they realize China is an economic threat to U.S. power. And then two, the other thing is the whole communism factor, which, by the way, we actually do not have a true communist country in the world. We really don't. But it is what it is. Anyway, it's just like when she comes in and she says that we don't have to have an answer, but he's asking you. It's like, but he's asking you, do you support it? What would you do? So to come back and say, we don't have to have an answer for everything. If you are president of the United States, you're going to have answers, especially when it comes to foreign policy, when you may not want to. That's the thing about being president. And this is the thing I told you before about the foreign policy. That's a big one for me because that is an area where the president can act alone and doesn't necessarily need the approval of Congress to do so. Obama has done this. So the thing is that if you are president of the United States, you're going to have to say something better than that. That's the promise. Or the problem, excuse me, the promise.
It's okay to process something. And the larger question about surveillance and data mining is not something that we should avoid.
What about
the surveillance thing? I think in reference to like the TikTok, I really do feel like this is being blown out of proportion, not necessarily by Marianne, but just in general. We're going to get to the TikTok segment after this story. I do feel like, you know, the way that they were focused on the creator of TikTok yesterday in those hearings, I'm like, some of the questions they were asking him, they need to ask Mark Zuckerberg. They need to ask Google. They need to ask any of these apps that are on your phone. They can all do the same thing. And just because an app was created outside of the US, all of a sudden they see it as a threat. But like I said before, this is more about their economic fear that they have with a country like China, because economically China is doing pretty well, especially when you look at the banking industry. They have most of the banks in the top 10. We do not. That was not always the case. And I say this because if you look at an app like Spotify, Spotify was not made in America. Spotify is a Sweden app, but you don't see them grilling Spotify. They can also use our data. But let's go on.
the U.S.-Chinese relationship, just more generally, do you see the Chinese as a kind of competitor of American hegemony? Do you see them as something greater than that, say like an adversary, or do you see them as an enemy of the United States?
I want to stay away from any language like enemy of the United States. I want to stay away from anything even like adversary. We are a competitor, and we have we have a lot of economic interrelationship right now, and we should continue to be competitors, and we should be looking down the road and hoping for the day when cooperation and collaboration on such things as climate change will be the normalized position. In the meantime, we have some real differences with the Chinese Communist Party, and we should not pretend that those don't exist either. But we don't need a Cold War with China. We don't need saber rattling. That's not where we should be. We should be careful. We should try to remain competitors, yes, in a healthy way, hopefully for that day where it is healthy competition. And in the meantime, we're not naive either about the Chinese Communist Party.
I wish people would stop referring to it as that. Don says, if China was spying on us, wouldn't there be evidence in the coding? That's a good point, Don. Yeah, I know everyone keeps, well, not everyone, people keep saying the Chinese Communist Party. And the thing is, like, why can't you just say China? Because I feel like when people do say that, and this is not just a Marianne thing, I've seen a lot of people do this in mainstream media. They keep saying that as if they're trying to use that word communism to make the American people more afraid of China. I feel like that's really why they do that, instead of just saying China. You know, it just, I don't know. But let's go on.
So one of the tactics of the TikTok CEO when testifying for 6 hours in the face of very hostile bipartisan questioning was to try and claim, I think often validly, that many of the concerns that were raised about TikTok, and you suggested this yourself in a prior answer, were also true of Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and Google for sure, namely questions of how we're being tracked and how that data is being weaponized and how it's being sold. Another big concern about big tech recently from the Twitter files, but also other reporting, has been the attempts by the United States government through agencies like the CIA, the FBI, Homeland Security, to influence content moderation or censorship decisions by big tech. There's two sides of that argument. One is those agencies have no role whatsoever to play in how those private companies make those decisions. The other is, no, actually a lot of the content on big tech is a threat to the United States, and we want those agencies that are designed to protect us telling these companies what they regard as potentially dangerous, potentially harmful to American citizens. What is your view on sort of the Twitter files and the revelations of them and the proper role between the U.S. security state on the one hand and big tech on the other?
Well, I don't want the Chinese Communist Party messing with me, but I don't want the CIA messing with me either.
Do you guys see what I'm saying about I don't like it. I don't like the repetition of the Chinese comedy. I don't like that. it just, I don't know. Like, I feel like I'll come back. Come back to me.
So the idea that the CIA is going to protect me by anything it's doing at Facebook does not necessarily make me feel safer or happier. At the same time, if there is any regulation to be had regarding protection of privacy, it's much easier for the U.S. if it's an American company. So I don't want anyone collecting my data, but I don't see the CIA as the great protector of all things private.
Right, but
so Glenn's going to come up with a follow-up because, again, it's like, Eric, you hit it right on the head. This is what I was leaning towards. Yeah, that's how I feel. Like, that's what it is. Saying CCP is red baiting. It give me like it's like a dog whistle feeling. Like, I don't like it. I don't like it when people keep saying that. Like, it just rubs me the wrong way. But Glenn's going to come up with a follow-up here. Stephanie, you're right, Sabby. She's China baiting. I don't like it. I don't like the whole, like, the stop. No. All right. He's coming with a follow-up here to that question because Glenn, again, I guess he feels like he didn't get a solid, I guess, answer, so to speak.
But based on things you've seen, do you think that is a real concern, namely that the FBI, the CIA, Homeland Security sees the internet as a tool, not for necessarily propagandizing other countries, which arguably is within the scope of its mission, but propagandizing Americans as well and interfering in our politics? Do you think that is a problem that they've been doing that? Do you believe that's something they've been doing?
I think it is legitimate to suggest it. I think that it is part of good citizenship to be constantly holding to a reasonable and appropriate skepticism about overreach by anybody. Now,
but here's the part here. So I'm not sure if Marianne has looked at the Twitter files, but even just if you haven't looked at the Twitter files, let's go off of like history and evidence that's come out recently. When she says she thinks that it's legitimate to suggest it, nah, like it's been proven though. Like it's been proven with Fred Hampton. It was proven with MLK. It was proven recently with Malcolm X. Actually, his family is suing the FBI and the NYPD and the CIA. They're suing 3 agencies that basically killed Malcolm X. So there have been, when we look at even just the revolutionary leaders, it has been confirmed that they were killed by those government agencies. So to say that it's legitimate to suggest it, it's already been proven. So this is the piece. I think that's why Glenn probably did a follow-up there, because let's say you haven't seen the Twitter files, and that's fine. It is what it is. Also, everybody's not on Twitter. It is what it is. But based on the information that has come out over the past couple of years, it has been confirmed that they have killed revolutionary leaders. I don't know if Marianne is aware of that, or maybe she is aware, but she just didn't feel comfortable saying it. And so she says, I think it's legitimate to suggest it. But no, you have to be very clear about this here. It is not a suggestion. It has been confirmed. So I think if I was her, I would look into that. Look into those cases.
Not only by the corporations, but also by the government. It's both. Neither one of them should be getting in our business in places where they should need to stay the hell out. And that applies to Facebook, and it applies to the CIA.
All right, let me ask you one more question about foreign policy before we just kind of shift right into domestic policy, which is, for a long time, on the kind of progressive wing of the Democratic Party, one of the major foreign policy debates was the question of the relationship between the Israeli and the Palestinians. The issue has taken on a little bit more attention in light of the foreign aid that the United States gives to Israel. Obama signed a record-setting deal with Netanyahu for billions of dollars a year that the United States transfers to Israel every year. The Israeli government is undergoing a lot of changes in terms of its ideological makeup. There are people inside the government who just explicitly say, we do not believe in a two-state solution. We believe all of the West Bank belongs to Israel. Would you, as an American president, continue to unconditionally provide that aid to Israel, or would you demand changes in Israeli behavior before getting that aid? And if so, what changes would you require?
would you demand that aid? So the aid that's going to Israel.
Well, first of all, that 3.8 billion through 2008 is already codified into law. But we can use the fact that that is codified into law to exert leverage. There is behavior on the part of the Israeli government, particularly now, particularly with this extreme right-wing swing that they're taking. The United States absolutely has the right to say, if you're going to take any money, which, as I said, is codified into law through 2028, this money absolutely cannot be used in any way that transgresses against the democratic values upon which we purport to stand. We don't always do that perfectly here. I don't think any conscious person thinks that we do, but it must be our ideal. And it must be our ideal not only in the way we behave here, but in behavior that we support, particularly with our money and our financial leverage in other countries. The United States absolutely has the right to make certain demands about how that money is used. Absolutely.
Yeah, for a long time, the argument of supporters of Israel in the West was, we're trying to facilitate a two-state solution, that the Palestinians should have their own
Here comes the two-state part.
sovereign state side by side with the Israeli state. If you ask almost anybody in that region at this point, people regard that as a virtual impossibility, largely due to just how many incursions there have been into the West Bank by what the UN and the international community regard as illegal settlements that would be almost require a civil war within Israel to actually remove. Do you still consider the two-state solution a viable solution? And if not, what do you see as what the United States should be pushing for there?
Do you still consider the two-state solution to be a viable solution? And if not, what should the U.S. be pushing for there to happen?
Unfortunately, I have come to realize that it's more dead than I had hoped. I had felt that the two-state solution was dead, but I believe in resurrection, you know? We are living at a time, though, when it is becoming less and less reasonable to even bring it to the table. I believe that the United States should be giving robust and equal support to both security and the human rights of both the Israelis and the Palestinians. And as you were talking about the possibility of something as horrifying as civil war there, 250,000 people were protesting on the streets of Tel Aviv recently. The efforts of the Netanyahu government to basically get rid of their Supreme Court. So the Israelis, I think, have come to a point where some changes are going to have to be made. So decisions are going to have to be made. I think not only the Palestinians, obviously, not only other Arab nations, not only many people within the left, within Israel, not only those of us in the United States who are concerned, not only people elsewhere in the world. Israel is going to have to address the basic fundamental moral flaw that is present. I want Israel to exist, but we are coming to a point where it's becoming very clear. It's coming to a head in a way more than it has ever before in the history of that country. And the United States has to stand on the side of human rights for all people. We must.
But thank you, Krona. So will she not be sending money then? That's the question I had. That was the question I had. And then also, so does she still believe in the two-state solution or not? Like, I felt like that was a roundabout answer. Like, that really puzzled me. She was like, well, it seems like it's hard to bring it to the table. But then she says the United States should be giving aid to both. And I want to explain there was something that Amani Oakley said on Twitter. I wish I still had the tweet, darn it. But I felt like she made a good comparison in reference to separate but equal. If you go back in the US, like go back to history, remember Plessy versus Ferguson established separate but equal. But then later on, Plessy versus Ferguson was overturned by Brown versus Board of Education because, studies showed that although Black people and white people were separate, the facilities were not equal. The schools weren't equal. And in reference to the education system, the medical system, like nothing was equal. Black people obviously had less. And it was their facilities were in rough shape, right? So Amani Oakley pointed this out, and she brought up a really good point that, like, for the people who continue to push the two-state solution, That's like the equivalent to the idea of separate but equal that we had in the United States. And we've already known that that's been proven not to be the case. Because what will happen, even with like the two-state solution, yeah, they'll be separate, but they won't be equal because the Palestinians are the minority now. Most of them have been pushed out or beaten or killed. And that needs to be said. And I think some of these candidates are afraid to say that because they know that big money's going to come in from AIPAC and that is going to destroy their chance or their possibilities of actually winning. But you have to come forward and say that. You have to speak for the Palestinian people. Like, you got to just condemn it and be like, look, these people were brutalized. These people were murdered. They were taken out of their homes. They were pushed out. There's no nice way to say it. I'm just being real here. No nice way to say it. So I'm still confused. I don't know if she still wants to do two-state or not.
So shifting our attention to United States politics, given that that's where you're about to immerse yourself in, obviously when...
This is such a good point, Roger. Thank you for the super chat. You want Israel to exist, but do you want Palestine to exist? And this is a really good way of framing this because I keep hearing people say what she just said, that they do want Israel to exist. But it's like, you're right. Like, where's the I do want Palestine to exist? Well said, Roger. Thank you so much for that. We're going to go into this part here, and then we're going to go to the next story.
When someone stands up like you're doing and saying, I'm going to run as a challenger representing the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, the model that comes to mind for a lot of people is Bernie Sanders, even though you're two different candidates and two different people. It seems like, I think it's fair to say you're more or less in the same lane, occupying the same kind of political faction within the Democratic Party. Bernie in 2016 and then again in 2020, according to a lot of his supporters, had his candidacy sabotaged in various ways. In 2016, even Donna Brazile and Elizabeth Warren said they thought the DNC rigged the election in favor of Hillary and against Bernie. And then in 2020, maybe it wasn't as dramatic, but clearly there was an establishment effort to get Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar out of the race at the critical time. Beto O'Rourke, all of them kind of unified. Elizabeth Warren stayed in longer than it seemed rational for her to do so, siphoning the votes, and then refused to endorse Bernie Sanders. So there,
because she was a snake, Glenn.
are a lot of people who say, even if you're able to galvanize people the way that Bernie did, bring a big movement behind you, the Democratic Party is such a corrupted party and institution that they will never let you win. They will even, in fact, cheat if they have to prevent you from winning the way that they did to Bernie. Do you think that is what happened in 2016 and or 2020? And if so, what is the hope that you can provide people that you have a chance to win within the Democratic Party?
Do you think they cheated Bernie? And what hope can you give people that you will survive in the Democratic Party?
It's clearly what happened in 2016, and it's clearly what happened in 2020. And remember, I was there too. So I have my own visceral experience of what they'll do if they feel that you're any kind of an inconvenience. And to be honest, I've only been running for 9 days, and I already see what they're doing to me now. So, yeah, you're right. But I also heard Cenk Uygur say something the other day, and I think it was true. He pointed out that Bernie came within striking distance, and he said, somebody is going to break through. Somebody, Glenn, is going to break through. Now, whether that will be me or not, even if I don't break through, if I'm pushing that much more, we have to, anytime we see it, it could be the labor movement, it could be somebody running as a progressive, it could be an NGO, it could be independent media. We all just have to support the pushing through. And at some point, somebody is going to. But I feel that if you're not running as a Democrat, you don't have quite the capacity to call the system on its own, tendency to rig. I mean, the fact that I'm experiencing what I'm experiencing, and then I can say, because I'm running as a Democrat, Joe Biden should debate me. That I can say, because I'm running as a Democrat, it should be the Democratic voters who decide what is the agenda and who is the best person to take on the Republican candidate in 2024. I can say that. I can be that inconvenience to them because I'm running as a Democrat. Now, I understand the blowback I'm getting. God knows I'm getting it. But I hope that people will understand the importance of supporting the person who's going out and saying that, because the only factor that can override this is we the people. And when I got out of the race in 2020, I said to my supporters that I would do everything I could going forward to inconvenience those who I feel need to be inconvenienced. This whole thing with political parties, they're not mentioned in the Constitution. George Washington warned us against them, said they would form factions of men more concerned with their party than with their country. John Adams said they were a threat to a democracy. Third-party voices have been extremely important in our history. At the same time, however, now Democrats and Republicans have sort of formed this unholy alliance to make it very difficult to run as an independent or as a third party.
I'll just say something really quick in reference to what she was saying about eventually somebody will break through. So that could take a long time, right? And I have a feeling that the person that does break through, by the time they do break through, they're not going to uphold those progressive policies. And I can see that happening with someone like Ro Khanna. I think Ro Khanna is going to run in 2028. And I think that if he does break through, just know that he is already sold out. Let's make that very clear. Just know that it's already have been decided that he's not going to push for Medicare for all. Those things aren't going to happen. They're not going to let him in. They're not going to let someone in who really wants to implement something like Medicare for all by executive order. They're not going to put that person in, because then that will do away with big pharma. Big pharma donates to a lot of these politicians, which means that they could lose some of their seats. It's all connected to the money. And that's what people have to understand. And so sometimes people get upset with me when I say that it doesn't matter who the person is, it's the system that's the problem. But that's the reality of the situation. You have these parties that are owned by corporations. But to her point, when she said eventually somebody is going to be able to break through in the Democratic Party, the best chance that we had of that happening for the presidential position was with Bernie Sanders. He had the numbers, he had the support. That really was our best shot. Now, maybe someday someone will come along and they'll be more popular than Bernie was. But like I said, if they get in, just know that means that the DNC is on their side. And if the DNC is on their side, then that means that they have already sold out before they even had a chance to get in. And that's important for people to fully grasp. But to that point, eventually someone's going to break through. All these years that we've been waiting for someone to break through, we could have already built a third party movement. This is the piece where me and Nick and CJ, this is what we push back on all this time. Like David Sirota said in an interview with Crystal and Kyle, he's been doing this for like decades. He's been trying to fight this for like decades. So it's like all this time, we could have already been building a third party movement. That is our point. Let's go on.
Person. So we just have to be in there wherever our heart leads us to. And I think being in there as a Democratic candidate, saying this is not 100 years ago, a bunch of men sitting around a table smoking cigars should not be just deciding Biden is the one. That's what was happening.
But that's what happens still today. And if you look up the DNC fraud lawsuit, like Nico House, he was the one that broke that story. That's still what happened. That's exactly still what happens today. It's already decided. It's already people have already chosen. They've already been selected. It's just a matter of whether or not the American people will come out. But most of the time, the person that's selected, the American people have been convinced to come out and support them. Bernie Sanders, for example, was not selected. Do you see what I mean? It's already been decided. They're already talking about who they got their picks for 2024 if Joe Biden don't run. They're already talking about they got their picks for 2028. Oh, I would love to see him and da-da-da-da. They've already chosen people. That has not changed.
Happened to the Democratic Party. We should be independent thinkers. What's this codependent relationship with the DNC? I think it should be the voters who should decide.
If you want us to be independent thinkers, though, then you can't run through the two-party system. Not in politics. This is the part here that kind of rubbed me the wrong way too. And she said, like, what's this attachment to the DNC? That's part of the Democratic Party. That's part of it. So when you run through the Democratic Party, that's what you have to go. You have to deal with the DNC. That's just how it is. the people who were independent thinkers that were even remotely a part of the Democratic Party, they're all gone. They were pushed out. So anybody else like them that tries to come through, they block it.
I appreciate any support anyone gives me, and having the opportunity to say to the primary voters, I don't believe that anything short of a fundamental economic U-turn is what the American people deserve, what will beat the Republicans in 2024, and even more importantly, will repair this country. So this is not a time when we should be offering just a little. We should be offering a lot, because the people deserve it.
Right, and that was Bernie's argument in 2016 for sure, right, was we need a political revolution, not tinkering on the margins. And one of the reasons why Bernie succeeded so much more than anyone expected he would against the incredibly formidable and sometimes seemingly invulnerable Clinton political machine within the Democratic Party was because he was able to attract a huge number of voters, people forget in 2016, who are not kind of traditional Democratic voters. Lots of people who don't identify necessarily with the Democratic Party, who feel disaffected from the two-party system you were just describing. Yeah, and so, are you able to hear me?
No, I can hear you now.
Okay, yeah. So I was kind of saying that one of the reasons why Bernie did so well in 2016 is he attracted a lot of non-traditional Democratic voters, people who don't necessarily identify as Democrats, who feel disaffected from the political system and from both parties. What are is that part of your strategy to be able to speak to people who don't wake up every day and say, I'm part of the Democratic Party? And if so, what is your strategy for trying to reach those people?
Well, first of all, the word strategy, Donald Trump didn't have a strategy. He hit a nerve. My only strategy, the truth as I understand it. I know that there are a lot of young people who, they don't even have an institutional memory of a time when either party did much more than thwart their dreams. So I know that there are young people who hear this message. A lot of the sort of normie blue check Democrat types think that I don't even have a right to be there. It drives me crazy a little bit. The founders, James Madison, gave me the right to be there with a little help from Susan B. Anthony. This idea that other people don't have a right. It's like sometimes I feel like the Democratic Party is intent on shrinking itself, on shrinking its own base. So
they don't really care because they just want to fundraise. Like, that's really what it comes down to. If they lose, it doesn't matter because they still were able to fundraise. And I think, it goes back to the question that he asked, like, what is the strategy?
I am saying, when I first started my career as a writer, there was, I assume he's still around, a writer named Arnold Patton. And I read something he said. He said, if you genuinely have something you need to say, there is someone out there who genuinely needs to hear it. That is what has always guided my career. I think there are some things that need to be said in this country. We need to say that the economic system is rigged, that only 20% of Americans have an easy time in this country, and that if you're living in that 20% where the economy is pretty good for you, you were surrounded by 80% of Americans who are living in a vast sea of economic despair, where 1 in 4 Americans live with medical debt, where 68,000 Americans die every year from lack of health care, where 18 million Americans cannot fill the prescriptions that their doctors give to them.
But I think the problem is everything that she's saying right now, these are all things that Bernie Sanders said. And they still prevented him from getting it. You see the problem? So I think that's why when Glenn asked her, like, what is your strategy? And she says, well, I don't really look at a strategy. Like, no, because you're saying the same things that Bernie Sanders said. So you need to have a strategy, because as you see, Bernie did it twice in a row and he still couldn't get in. We'll finish up with this.
Half of our seniors live on $25,000 and less a year, where 1/3 of American workers are living on less than $15 an hour and cannot find a place to live. Someone needs to say that. Someone needs to name the corruption of the economic system that keeps that in place. Someone needs to name the legalized bribery that is the essence of the political system at this time. And somebody needs to say to the American people, vote for me, and we can change that.
So just on the last topic,
we have to stop there. Sorry, guys. But the thing is that someone did say all those things. I don't know. Thank you for the tip, Roger. Sab, if you had to guess between America getting embarrassed by China out competing us and politicians, donors in the form of YouTube crying to them, saying TikTok's kicking our ass, please do something, government. What percentage would you say belongs to one versus the other? Question 2, the pushback against you critiquing AOC. Do you think that you're getting less pushback from AOC stands today than in years past? Yeah, I do think it has decreased somewhat. I think like a year ago it was worse. A year ago when I used to call these things out about like AOC or any of the squad members, how they were voting, and people were just like, I needed to be more patient and yada yada and all that jazz. But it's not as many people doing that today, I would say. I think for anyone who still had that hope left, now she still has a big base, but I think for those who still thought that it could be a something, but they may have been like, maybe they had 1 foot in the door and one foot in the room and 1 foot like out the door. I think that railroad strike, or breaking the railroad strike, I think that did it for a lot of people. That did it for a lot of them. All right, let me go to these comments and we'll get to our next story. Bill says no blank check, just continuous billion-dollar checks indefinitely, which is not the same or something. The Oracle says Marianne needs to take several seats. It is clear that she's not ready to reckon with the truth in the way that will contrast sharply enough with Biden. Right. And that's one of the things that Nick was hitting on. Delthea, Zelensky wants troops on the ground. He then wants to stand behind American service members and talk trash to Putin like the drunk who starts fights, then whispers to his friends, hold me back. That's funny. That's funny. Joe says China's government is feudalism and its economy is capitalism. Jeremy said Marianne is no Jill Stein. No.